Dr. Devine, talk about how it works for you with respect to the group that you work most closely with, which is people who've served time in prison, felons.
Yes, well, first let me thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and to lend some insight to this conversation. I work with a population of individuals who've been convicted of criminal offenses, some of whom are on parole, some of whom are on probation, some of whom have served time and then returned to the community and don't really understand whether or not they can vote. There's a lot of misinformation. There are a lot of people who don't know that people who are on probation can vote, even though they've been convicted. People who are in jail can vote because they are waiting to be sentenced, so they haven't yet to be convicted.
Whose job is it to give them that information?
Well, it seems to me that those who are responsible for the elections should give that information. But I think that the academic world also has a responsibility to provide that information. I think that the average citizen has a responsibility to be aggressive in acquiring information. I think it's a shared responsibility. I don't think that we can.
How does somebody do it? And I should say Dr. Pryor, I guess. How does somebody do it? You've had the experience. You've served your time. Perhaps you're in a state where maybe you weren't allowed to vote inside, although some states you are.
Yes.
But you're out. You're supposedly entitled. What do you have to do?
Well, you shouldn't have to do anything. In fact, currently, the only thing that you have to do is show up like anybody else. I mean, once you're no longer on parole, you can just go and vote like any other citizen. Unfortunately, we still have some old practices at the polls where people are being asked to prove that you're not on parole, to prove that you're eligible, although legislatively that has been prohibited. We have some practices. I think the larger issue has to do with, first, disenfranchisement is not a new issue. I think that there's fear that individuals with criminal convictions are going to vote a particular kind of way. I think that there's this whole issue about moral turpitude. Should they even be allowed to vote? I mean, the fact that they've committed a crime, the whole question of whether or not they are ethically or morally, sound, comes into play. But I think
they're supposedly called corrections institutions.
Exactly.
That something gets corrected by the time you get through.
They've served their time, and if there's some behavior that needed correcting, we're assuming that while they were in custody, that behavior has been corrected, and that raises some other questions. But I think that what we have to keep in mind is that individual groups being disenfranchised is not new to America. I mean, particularly we know, former slaves were disenfranchised. A lot of folks don't know that directly after the Emancipation Proclamation, a whole set of laws. I mean, just the whole idea of a person being a vagrant. I mean, directly after slavery, someone who was not fully employed and didn't have a place of residence applied to all 4 million slaves. The idea that you would have to pass a literacy test, and if you did so, you were then arrested because the only way that you could pass a literacy test after slavery is if you learn how to read during slavery, which was against the law. And this was intentional. See, what we have to understand is disenfranchising groups is not something coincidental or accidental. This is done intentionally to exclude particular groups from the voting polls.
One of the things that Angela Davis always recalls is that there are little amendments to the amendments to the Constitution that actually allow the disenfranchisement of felons in certain states, and those were all laws that were put into place right after Reconstruction, yes. Right, Francis?
Well, it was the felon disenfranchisement laws were a way of restoring at least a part of the Southern labor system, which was a slave system. Lots of the freed slaves took to the road because they no longer had employment. When they took to the road, they were susceptible to arrest as vagrants. Once they were arrested as vagrants and imprisoned, they were disenfranchised. So it was part of a kind of system of law and practice which stripped of the freedmen of the rights that they had won during the Civil War.
So at a time when society was in transformation, was about to, whether it liked it or not, accept a whole new set of people into the population, as it were, as full, free people, you saw these laws come in place. Right now, bring us up to date, Wendy, we're at a moment where in this country we're going through another transformation with influxes of new populations on the very close horizon, a majority, so-called minority country. A lot of people are nervous about some of the very same things they were nervous about in the 1860s and 70s. How is it playing out in different states? What are you seeing in New Mexico, in Nevada, in Arizona, in particular where there are places where the fight is around immigration, residence status, and all that we've been talking about?
Yeah, we're seeing, especially in battleground states and in states with a lot of immigrants and a lot of new restrictions on voting. And this is somewhat reminiscent of what went on in the past. The restrictions range from requirements that people prove their citizenship with certain documents in order to register to vote. We see that in Arizona. To new barriers to getting on the voter rolls, sending them through an error-prone computer match that misses 20% of eligible voters. We're seeing that in Florida and Iowa, for example, and there are efforts to try and push this through in Wisconsin. We could knock out 20% of voters, new voters this way. We're seeing an influx of new students. I mean, there's a lot of enthusiasm among young voters, and we're now seeing a lot of pushback and a lot of misinformation and efforts to make it harder for them to register to vote, and even intimidation of students. So these are some of the kinds of things. We're also seeing wide-scale purges of the voter rolls. And this is done witut notice to the voters, in secret, with error-prone processes that are prone to manipulation. We've seen discriminatory purges in the past. There was a purge list that was disclosed in Florida in 2004 that systematically over-included African Americans and under-included Hispanic voters. And so this is, there are a lot of new barriers that are prone to error and manipulation that affect really these new voters and immigrant populations, new citizen immigrants more than other voters.
How are you, with the Youth Voter Collective, Docia, responding to people's concerns? Because the one thing you don't want is for a whole population that got themselves excited during the primary to, by the time it gets to Election Day, have given up because it just seems so impossible.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main things with young people in the voting process is just information in general. I mean, not even college students, like when we've gone and registered high school students, I mean, they don't even know that you need to register about the candidates, about the issue, about knowing where your polling site is. So there's a lot of just information in general that needs to get out there. But also, I think giving people concrete tools for this is what you do if Election Day something happens, right? Calming people's fears about where are you registered and how that process works. So really making sure that people who are even out there registering voters know the information about people's rights on Election Day.
So be clear, if you're in a college town and you've been there since the beginning of the semester, you've registered there, will that registration count in November?
Yes.
No worries.
I wouldn't say it's a no-worry situation, right? You face the possibility of being asked for ID when you don't necessarily need to prove it. Oftentimes students are challenged at the polls, which is something also that creates long lines. We were talking about this before this segment. These long lines often keep young people from being able to vote. You have to stand for 2-3 hours. So there's a lot of things that they're going to face, and we've also seen, threatening letters coming out from the registrar that this might affect your tax status or your ability to be on your parents' insurance or all of those things. And so, really, I think the best strategy is to be in those places, to be on campuses and talking to students.